Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivanna and Sam.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Transformation in Trials. I'm very excited today to be joined by Jon I Bergsteinsson, who is a founder of Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru. Hi, Jon.
Hi, Sam. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. And Ivanna and I were really excited to get you on this episode of Transformation in Trials. We're going to go quite deep into your background and experience, Jon, as we get into the episode. Now, to date, a lot of our focus has been on pharma trials. And this time we want to turn our attention more to a topic that I know that you have great experience and insight on, and that's medical device trials. So as a starter for Jon, perhaps you could just talk to us about clinical research in medical device trials.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's actually a very interesting question because most people tend to ask me, what is the difference between medical device and pharma? They just want to get into the details, but actually the state of the industry is quite different. So traditionally, medical devices have been put to the market throughout Europe and the US, for example, by following a regulatory pathway that requires more of a comparison to existing devices rather than proclaiming something on your device and getting that improved and for market sales like that. So what that has resulted in is that clinical research surrounding medical devices has been very much of a focus from physicians or clinical experts that are using them rather than the manufacturers themselves. So it's often and very common for clinicians and physicians that have been using devices for one intended use, that have been interested in, for example, trying to apply it in another for another diagnostic area or another area of interest to see whether it's equally as helpful or successful to be used and apply with that particular area of interest. So a lot of medical device manufacturers have either gone down two routes, conducting a number of clinical research studies on their own devices throughout the market access process, which, to be honest, are not as many as you would hope. And then you have another type of medical device manufacturer or medical device company that has gone more of the equivalence route or predicate device route in the US, whereas they've claimed equivalence or similarities with existing devices, conducted minimal clinical research or research in general on the devices, and that rather had clinicians out there in the market conduct more of what's called a post-market clinical study or post-market research on their devices, which sometimes also are called investigator-initiated studies. What is changing, though, the state of the industry is changing right now. What is changing now is the new regulatory framework in the European Union surrounding medical devices is now forcing a lot of medical device companies to conduct a lot of this clinical research by themselves. So the new medical device regulation in the European Union contains a very simple sentence, which basically is changing the state of the industry. And now medical device companies have to be able to demonstrate that they have access to the clinical data that they're using to produce the regulatory submissions to get their device to market. So what that basically means is that device companies now have to start initiating their own clinical studies, so they have access to that data to be able to document their devices well enough to put them to market. So the clinical research within the medical device industry is now changing from being more of a post-market interest kind of research to more of a focused regulatory submission level research, which is what we've seen in pharmaceuticals for decades, of course. So that is the biggest change. And that change is being led by the changes now being implemented in the regulatory environment in the European Union.
Now that seems like significant change. So prior to this change then, am I correct in thinking that medical device companies, if I hear what you're saying correctly, could just lean on perhaps historical evidence that was created for, I don't know, a predecessor to a product that vaguely fell within the same category? For example, a hip replacement that had perhaps gone out to market originally in the 90s, but for a new generation of hip replacement, then the data could be leaned upon from studies that may have happened some years back.
True. So the regulatory routes, especially in the European Union, allowed you to do that depending on the classification of device, because medical devices are classified differently depending on the risk or application of use. So high-risk devices like implants, they couldn't really do that solely. They had to do some clinical studies, clinical investigations, as they're called for medical devices. But for lower risk devices, for example, class 2A or 2B, which are short-term implantables or devices that are used maybe at point of treatment during other complex surgeries, they could go through the route of equivalence or predicate devices, for example, sometimes referred to as 510K under the FDA, by simply taking historical evidence from publications and articles that are already available on similar devices and using that as an evidence base around their own devices.
Interesting. And has something specific driven this change by the European Union Medical Device Directive? Has there been some kind of catastrophic event? I hope not, but normally any change, there's some kind of catalyst. People don't just wake up one day and go, we must change tact for all these reasons.
No, yeah, well, there has, yes. There not one event, there are multiple events. So since the 2000s, early 2000s, regulatory bodies, competent authorities in Europe, especially also outside of Europe, have been identifying a number of safety issues on medical devices that have gone through these routes. And it's the most critical issues that have been identified, which have basically led the regulatory bodies in Europe to establish a new regulatory framework for medical devices. If I'm to mention one or two, the most notable that people might remember are, for example, the silicone breast implants or PIP breast implants that were actually got into the news and got famous for being a safety concern. And that was purely because not purely, but one of the causes was that they were using non-medical grade silicone in some of their products. But there were also a number of issues with how they put the device to market. For example, it wasn't clinically tested enough. And there are other examples from other vendors here in Europe, but also outside of Europe, where they've proclaimed their devices be safe for use in one particular diagnosis, but have then led to a number of long-term safety implications for the patients. And here we're, for example, talking about meshes and other interesting, short or long-term implantables that have actually been of great concern in terms of safety, because they might have small alterations in their designs or biocompatibility or other things that maybe allowed them to be put to market as predicate or equivalent devices. But because of these small changes or design changes that were made, they had long-term effects were more prone to produce safety issues. So the combination of these multiple events that become more and more popular to report to authorities because of safety issues with patients have led to authorities realizing that there's a need to do something about that.
Got it. Understood. And has there been much pushback from the device manufacturers or others in the industry, I guess? Because part of me feels like when you introduce, rightly or wrongly, if you introduce regulation, then it potentially not reduce innovation, but it might the time to innovate might be extended, if you like, because you have to go through these different procedures, trials, etc. Whereby before you didn't have that red tape, for want of a better term. Do you have a perspective on this, Jon?
Yeah, so one is that the European Union decided to do something about it, create a whole new regulatory framework, but FDA has also been doing something about this. They have upped their game when it comes to the 510K pathway. They have put more focus on post-market surveillance. They've requested some companies to conduct or collect more clinical data for around their 510Ks maybe than they did before. The European Union has made this huge change in the regulatory framework, which has impacted how you put your device to market. So to answer your question, this does impact innovation and development in many ways, because now to be able to get to market, you will need to be funded better. That's the end result, basically. You need more money to be able to handle the upgrades in regulatory requirements, and B, potentially to conduct studies or investigations that you might not have had to do if you went through the classical equivalence route. This does require companies, medtech founders, to seek more funding, but whether that actually impacts the speed and innovation is something that I would not be able to answer right now, and I don't think anybody will be able to answer that. However, there's a lot of loud voices in the industry that are raising concerns on the number of notified bodies, because notified bodies have traditionally been the gatekeepers, and are right now the gatekeepers of whether or not you are able to get your approvals that are needed to sell your products in the European Union. So the number of notified bodies have drastically been reduced because of the heightened requirements for the regulatory frameworks. And because of that, there are fewer notified bodies, and there are companies fighting for the same notified bodies, which results in fewer companies getting notified bodies, and thus fewer companies able to get their certificates in to be able to sell the products. So if you look at it in that way, that can impact innovation and focus on a speed of getting new products to market. This also impacts existing devices in the market, because the new medical device regulation in Europe, and I would primarily talk about the European impact here. The new medical device regulation in Europe and the European Union requires that all medical devices are recertified according to this new regulation. So there's no so-called grandfathering of existing devices. Existing devices won't get a free pass. Existing devices will have to claim some kind of what's called clinical evaluation that is acceptable to be able to get their certificate renewed. So if you also take into account not only the new devices, but also existing devices that need to be recertified, we're looking at a potential huge issue. And this is what the MedTech Europe Trade Association has put a lot of focus on. This has already resulted in the medical device regulation being delayed 1 year. It first got applicable a year ago in 2021, but it was actually supposed to be applicable from May 2020. But because of COVID and the raise of concerns for a number of notified bodies, it actually got delayed a year. But now the medical device regulation is in live. So certificates for existing devices and new devices need to be renewed and applied to and accepted before the end of 2024. Can't remember the details specifically, but there's going to be a number of companies that are going to be hit by this notified body issue.
Wow. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, this has probably caused a flurry of activity in multiple different segments of this industry.
By the 25th of May 2024, not all certificates issued under the old regulation have to be upgraded.
And that's insane. It's as if telling all the pharmaceutical or biotech companies, please reconduct your clinical trials to get.
Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah.
Right. Imagine that all pharmaceutical companies would have to recertify every single product. That is crazy if you think about it. But that's also what the trade associations and all the other association related that have something to say here in Europe, whether it's competent authorities or any other organizations within the medtech industry, have put a lot of focus on the number of notified bodies needs to improve.
Wow. And practically then, for people to get to comply with this regulation then for an existing product, does that, I know it could be on a case-by-case basis, but could it involve quite lengthy clinical trials in essence for them to be able to do that, even though the product is already being used in the marketplace? Or does it depend, to your point earlier, on the class of device concerned?
So, well, it depends. It always depends. For example, if you have a device that already has some data or has shown to be safe in a long-term setting, you won't have to put as much funds into it as a company that has zero data on long-term effects. So that company that has zero data on their long-term effects might need to initiate something to gather that. So depending on the device and what your connection with the notified body and how your existing technical file, as it's called, is structured, there are things you need to take care of and sometimes not, and things you need to worry about and sometimes not. But the cost highly depends on what you have already in terms of clinical data.
Got it. And practically then, Jon, what are device trials in this new world? What are they going to look like? And I guess comparing, if it's helpful to compare them versus a pharmaceutical trial, given that that's where a lot of our audience and listeners will be coming at this from, I think that would be helpful for us to understand.
So first thing we need to understand is that medical device studies and medical device clinical investigations, as they're called, are very different from pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. So whether the new regulation has been put into place or not, creating and designing and conducting a study for a medical device is vastly different. And they are as different as the medical devices are many. And the reason for that is because pharmaceuticals and drugs in general that are used with a human are usually somehow put into the body. So there's a lot of biochemistry and related science related to that needs to be included when you're conducting clinical study for a pharmaceutical type of product. Medical devices are not always implantable. And medical devices that are implantable or not often need a lot of assistance or special techniques or trainings or human factors involved in the process of its use that can highly, highly impact the outcomes of the use of the device. So what that means is that when you're conducting a study on a medical device, there's a range of data parameters surrounding its use and application in practice and just how they're applied in the workflow at a given clinical site versus another that can highly impact its results. So the way that you design studies for these devices can very much differ from one site to another. For example, there can be a device that's used for one indication, for example, an implant of some sort, a screw, that is used for an indication such as something, in the back. They're fixing the spinal cord somehow. And then the same screw could potentially be used in other places in the body. And you well know, as I do, that placing foreign objects in the body in different ways to do different things can greatly impact the outcome of the product's use. Yeah. And that's simply because of biomechanics and chemistry and so forth. So when all of that is taken into account, this requires a different approach to not only general study design, but also the specific data points that are collected. So when you look at it from that perspective, the study designs themselves are not that much different. The changes, when we look at the regulatory changes specifically, are mostly in the number of studies that need to be initiated and the scale. So for example, if you are an existing if you're a medical device that has existing products in the market, you already have some clinical data that you collected yourself on your devices. The scale of the data that you need to continue collecting under the new EU MDR, as we call it, might be much, much less than what your competitors might need to do if they have minimal or bare minimum data on their existing devices. So this could, for example, result in the company A that I mentioned before might suffice by purely collecting subjective data by asking surveys or general data, or general clinical experience data or information on the use in the market, whereas a device company B that has minimal data right now might need to conduct a full-blown observational type of a study because they don't have that data. So the difference is primarily in the scale and number of activities, let's say.
Yeah, wow. And who typically would advise the device companies on how to design these trials? Is it similar to the pharma world where they'd get in, well, based on experience, but also input from the regulator too?
So it is becoming more popular amongst medical device companies to use CROs or clinical consultants to help design their trials. But there's a lot of medical device companies who are also starting to recruit their own clinical operational teams. So a number of companies that have, multiple products in the market, they usually have an established clinical affair team, operations that can design and manage and operate all their studies. But smaller companies, which by the way, 95% of the medtech industry are small and medium enterprises, they often rely on consultants to assist them with designing studies. So we, for example, we work with a number of consultants and partners that we are potential customers with if they're trying to figure out how to design a study. And this is becoming especially more popular now as there are more companies that need to initiate studies.
Wow. What about, you touched on it briefly, but what about the type of data being collected? Is it representative of what we're seeing in pharma clinical trials where once a lot of data, I guess the main data source that everybody focused their attention to was EDC, but over recent years, we've seen an explosion of different other data sources, ePro, eCOA, wearable technology, lots of lab data. Have we also seen the same in med device trials too?
It's funny that you mentioned it because medical device trials have been relying on patient-reported outcomes and ePro for decades. And that's largely due to the fact that a lot of medical devices are used by the patients themselves. So it's difficult to collect the clinical data in your study solely from the clinician's perspective. And you often need to rely on standardized scales and questionnaires that are completed by patients to be able to collect the applicable data. So what I'd say is getting more popular within the industry. Laboratory values are also very common for class 3 devices, long-term implantable safety devices, because of course, if you implant something in the body, you need to follow the laboratory, the blood, the changes in blood or toxicity levels and stuff like that, just like with pharmaceuticals. Not maybe the same markers or whatever it might be, but similar. We're doing lab tests as well for at least high-class devices. But what is becoming more popular now is that you're including all of this in a kind of like a decentralized approach, similar to what we're seeing in pharma. But the funny thing is that it's not as new for a lot of medtech companies as it might be for pharmaceuticals, because like as I said before, many of them have been doing remote visits. Many of them have been doing ePro, and many of them have even been using wearables, because a lot of medical devices that are medical grade might be wearables. So they are collecting data already from their own medical devices, because these are the devices that are sometimes then often used in pharmaceutical trials as well.
And Jon, would it be fair to say that some of these human behavior studies that are also very new to pharma, and we're seeing a push to investigating how patients interact with medicine, that they're also something that you've done for many years in medical devices?
That is true. I mean, human factor testing and human factor studies have been required by the FDA for a number of years now. And a lot of the more complex devices that are, configurable interfaces, devices that are used in the ICU to control your breathing or an oxygen levels. I mean, many of these devices have very complex interfaces, and you can't put a device like that to market without doing human factor testing. Because, like I said before, the biggest difference between device and pharmaceuticals is that you have humans involved. It's not just a pill. You have a human that is involved in the process of using the device, and whether it's an implantable or not, it can highly impact the outcome, the results of using the device. And also, like I mentioned before, the workflows between two different hospitals using the exact same device for the exact same indication can be very, very different. So whether you conduct this test before or after the surgery, or you do A or B, or C and A before, depending on the process, the steps you take in actually implanting a device can be very different from one side to another. And this can impact the results. So that's also why a lot of the medical device companies are recording all of these, all the steps, all the things that are happening, which I guess pharmaceuticals are now just, catching up to. What was there something that did different there that could impact the result of the medication, for example?
No, it's interesting. In a former life, I used to sell orthopedic implants, and I think every surgeon would say that they were excellent and they could perform to the highest standards. But if you factor in surgeon performance as well, because they're implanting the actual prosthesis here, and like in all walks of life, you get people who are excellent and you get people who are more middle of the road. So
true.
Surely that has to have an impact too when you're designing these studies.
That is very true.
Yeah. So what got you into this space, Jon? Can you give us a bit of background about how you got fascinated and drew such a perspective about medical device trials, and maybe introduce us to what you're doing now at Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru?
Sure. So to start at the beginning, basically, what really sparked my interest to get into this industry was the fact that there is something called medical technology. So I'm a biomedical engineer as a background, and I've always been fascinated by medical devices and medical technology. And back in 2009 and 10, I was actually working in a clinical trial. I was working as a site staff member at a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical product. And I got to experience firsthand how complex and difficult it was to collect data throughout that study from every single patient that we got in for a visit. And back in those days, we were still using, handheld tablets, PDAs and paper, and one EDC for CRFs and one platform for the pros, and then one platform for the ECGs, and then another one for something else. And it was so complex, but still at the same time, I had a smartphone in my hand. I could do everything that I wanted to. So that kind of got me into the thinking that there must be something better, more useful, easy to use that we could create that could facilitate clinical data management and clinical data collection and clinical research. Slowly getting into that, I was introduced to the medtech industry and the changing regulations that were being drafted around 2012, when the first draft of the European Medical Device Regulation was published. We could clearly see that there was going to be a need to address clinical data collection for medical devices. So we founded Smart Trial with a focus on facilitating clinical data collection for medtech. And since 2013, we've been working alongside a number of companies in the industry all around the world, with 50 countries, with hundreds and hundreds of sites, thousands and thousands of patients that have gone through studies in Smart Trial for various medical devices. And now back in June, 8 weeks ago, Smart Trial got acquired by Greenlight Guru, which now makes up the first, the world leader in medtech lifecycle excellence platforms. So Greenlight Guru is now the only company in the world offering software services for medtech specifically that addresses everything from product to strategy, design, quality management, design controls, risk and regulatory information management, and then also now clinical data management, as a smart trial has now become a part of it. So going forth, our focus and vision is to continue facilitating medtech lifecycle excellence for the industry.
And maybe a question following up on the software part and the medical device part. Are there any commonalities between software development and medical device development in how you can structure it or the amount of iterations you can do compared to molecules?
The factors that are involved are the factors that you have a say in or you can control are more than what you would be able to control in pharmaceuticals maybe. So for example, if you're developing and designing a medical device, you have a very specific ISO standard for a quality management system that needs to be established for a medical device. That's the ISO 13485. There are additional standards that are required, for example, for electrical testing and stuff like that, which you also need to take into account if your device includes electricity and stuff like that, biocompatibilities, if it's implantable and so forth. But in essence, when you are designing a medical device, let's just say an orthopedic device, the factors involved in designing that, you are very much in control of. You decide how it looks like, how it's designed, how, what the ratio of this and that is, what the degree of angle is on that, what chemicals you're using on that and so forth. Whereas in biochemistry, you're working with live chemicals, right? You sometimes even chemicals that you are unsure of how will react when put into the human body. But for example, if you're producing a medical device, an implantable medical device, you know that carbon and titanium reacts in this and that way. It's already been proved, and it's safe. It's fairly easy to make more clear assumptions on how it will work in practice in the body.
And I had a couple of questions, just about the technology component in helping medical device trials. Obviously, there's a huge industry of vendors, different tech platforms that are all geared around clinical trials and the pharma industry primarily. Can we take that big ecosystem and just drop it into medical device trials and just lean on platform technologies and process to help it all work? Or do we need something that is best fit for medical device trials? And obviously you're biased, but
yeah, I was going to say, thank you for that question. You're really getting me a chance to pitch here.
I am interested in this because I think it's a topic that a lot of people would be really interested to hear about.
So if that was the case, if we could take the existing technologies and the platforms that we have in pharma and use it in medtech, we would probably already be doing that. But the fact is that most companies in the medtech industry today are actually still just working with paper. And the reason for that is paper and Excel and home developed databases. And the reason for that is because the platforms that are available, that pharma is using, are either A, not fitted to the purpose, or B, too costly to implement, operate, and set up and design and use. Either of these two factors have a great impact on whether or not you can implement this into your existing organization, because let's be honest here, medtech budgets are just the margin of what you see in pharmaceuticals. I'd say a medium medtech company's budget for clinical operations is probably similar to a startup biotech company, with 3 employees or something like that. The budget for running clinical operations for these companies is just a margin of what you see in pharmaceuticals, and that of course impacts on what kind of technology you can implement. That is one thing. What I mentioned before about the difference between the clinical research or how you conduct clinical studies in medical devices and pharmaceuticals also greatly impacts this, because when you have a platform technology that is focusing on servicing pharmaceuticals, they're designed to facilitate preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, 2A, 2B, 3, and 4. And the way that they're designed is often standardized on, this is how you collect adverse events. This is how you collect concomitant medication and medications. This is how you collect these and these variables and the labels, because everything has been designed to make it easier for pharmaceuticals companies to do that, to work. When a medical device company sees that, they're like, wait, no, adverse events are not reported like that for medical devices. That's one thing. The way that we conduct screening missions and business randomization is also very much different because of X, Y, and Z. The way that we collect this data is different because we're not looking at these and these blood parameters. We're interested in these and these blood parameters because, we're not changing any dynamics of this chemistry here or whatever it might be. So then there's a lot of questions to how can you fix that? How can you change that? Can you adjust this to me? And then most platform vendors will say, yeah, sure, but that will cost you extra. And then you suddenly, the business case is falling down through itself. The other factor involved in that is the type of activities conducted by clinical operations from medtech. Like I mentioned before, there might be companies that need to conduct post-market activities, but they're not going to do a clinical study. Sometimes they just need to do a case series report study, where you just simply enable somebody to report on a case in a standardized way every time they have a case. They might have a survey that needs to be published to a set of individuals. Then there needs to be a component in your software or platform that can do that, according to GCP. Sometimes you're doing just first in human studies, where you need to collect a range of variables on the device that's connected with a system that is purely used for devices, for imaging, for example, and stuff like that. And doing that within pharma is usually very, very expensive, but for devices where you usually just need minimal grade imaging, sometimes it can be easier to do that in a different fashion instead of using the high class, very advanced AI technology used for drugs. So the types of activities that you're conducting in medical devices also greatly impact whether you can use the existing platform technologies or not.
Got it. I also get a sense listening to you, and it's a people thing as well in terms of expertise in that space, because some of your points that you're talking about earlier,
exactly,
pharma geared organizations will talk in pharma centric language versus if you're living and breathing a particular segment of the industry, be it medical devices or pharma, the way that you talk about it is going to be in a way that's so much more fluent than if you're not living and breathing those conversations every single day. And I think that we shouldn't I personally don't underestimate that as a huge benefit in terms of clear communication.
That's true. We tend to say, the reason why companies work with us, Greenlight Guru or Smart Trial, is our medtech focus and expertise, which is mirrored in both our services and support and the way that we treat our customers, and the product, unique features that are specifically designed for medtech companies, for example, A, medtech reporting, or, design control processes according to the medical device standards. And then B, focus on providing and facilitating medtech compliance by offering ready-to-use templates and documents that can be integrated into the QMS surrounding the service that they're buying from us. And this is something that a lot of pharmaceutical vendors do not offer, because simply their platform technology is so complex. So usually the pharmaceutical companies, they create their own standards and SOPs and documents around their QMS. Medtech companies don't have either the knowledge or the understanding or the time to do that themselves. Again, back to a little bit resources, budgets. So these two factors and values that we offer to our customers are primarily the reasons why they select or choose to work with us.
That sounds great. And I love it. I personally love it when something like regulation just blows up an industry and causes lots of excitement in the industry and then creates opportunities for innovative companies to come and solve lots of different problems. So hats off to you on that one. As we start to round up our discussion, there's one question that we always ask our guests, just by way of closing, and that is, if there was one thing that you could change about our industry, what would that be?
When you say our industry, are you talking about?
That's a good one, actually. So, but you maybe you pick the medical devices industry.
If there was one thing I would like to change about the medtech industry, that would probably be a change of focus. So stop focusing too much on the product and how it's designed. Like that is one of the biggest issues with the medtech industry. Everybody is so focused on the solution, the medical device itself, and they completely forget about the patient and the clinicians and how they're going to get it to them. That is something that really, really needs to change in the industry, because there are thousands of new device ideas that are being spun out of universities and businesses around the world. They're thinking about solving a problem. There might be a problem, but is the problem big enough? Do the patients care? Do the physicians care? So I think it comes down to business validation.
Yeah.
That is probably the biggest change that we should be doing now, because we could put a lot more of the funding that have failed into actual devices that solve actual problems, instead of spending money on devices that haven't been validated well enough. I think it's a change that needs to happen within the industry when it comes to investments and business validation.
Amen to that. I think that's a good way to conclude the podcast episode. But I think for our listeners who've enjoyed what they've heard, Jon, where can they reach out to you to connect with you and maybe learn a bit more about what you're up to at Smart Trial by Greenlight Guru?
So the easiest way to reach out to me will probably be to use LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn, very active there. So find me on LinkedIn under Jon I Bergsteinsson. You can also get in touch with us at smart-trial.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Jon. Speak soon.
Thank you, Sam. And Ivanna, have a good day.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivanna Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.